Welcome to the Mental Advantage Podcast. Whether you're an athlete trying to perform at your best when it counts the most, a coach or business leader trying to get more out of your team, or someone looking for more personal growth, this is the place for you. This podcast is your map to guide you to the right mindset, systems, and strategies you need to become the best version of yourself. Now, here are your hosts, John Cullen and Brandon Allen.
All right, welcome to the Mental Advantage Podcast. We have Kamini Wood on the show tonight. And Brandon, this is one of those guests that I know I say it at the end of every one of the introductions to get your pen and paper ready, but I'm telling you, you and I both were joking that we were writing down a few pages of notes with this one.
Yeah, I think I ended up with 3 or 4 pages, and I know a half page of questions to still kind of dive into. So Kamini was amazing. A lot of great insight. To me, it was just, it's interesting. And I think the listeners will find it interesting that, she had really kind of, accomplished so much and said, hey, but this is not really my passion.
Yeah.
This is not, and you can hear her talk about like, or you hear the thing that was kind of driving her and burning inside of her was that servant leadership. And, she's now in a position to do that. Has helped, two of her 5 children, achieve very high level, achievement in ballet and, lacrosse. And I'm sure the other 3 are doing great things as well. And, it's interesting to me when you find these people, and it happens more and more on the podcast, where you find these people that were in this position and they were successful. And so they know how to leverage and what it takes to be successful, but it just wasn't kind of what was burning.
Yeah. The
passion. And so I just thought she was amazing. So much insight and more to share. I hope we can get her back.
What's the you just made me think of the 2 greatest dates of the day you were born, the day you know why, or something
right,
like
exactly
that.
Right.
You
yep.
learn why.
Yep.
And it's true. It's and why we were excited about this show for the listeners was because we knew she was bringing these different lenses with her, where she was, not only as she's a life coach, a best-selling author, but she's also a parent who, to your point, is got kids, high-performing kids, and we really unpack a lot of those things of like dealing with people who are high performers, whether that's in business or in athletics or young adults or older adults. But so Kamini Wood, for you listeners, is a certified life coach. As I mentioned, she helps high achievers heal their relationships with themselves, something she'll talk about in this episode. She's also a best-selling author, so you can look for her books out there, and is the creator of AuthenticMe, which I love. She tells you a little bit about this at the end of the episode, and the CEO of Live Joy Your Way. So without further ado, get your pen and paper ready, because here is Kamini Wood. Well, Kamini, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you have a busy schedule, as everybody just heard, the listeners heard anyhow from the introduction there. You've got your hands in a lot of different areas. So we always appreciate you taking time to joining us.
Well, I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, for sure. So, Kamini, I want to start because, I've had an opportunity as I was preparing for this podcast to listen to some of your appearances on other shows and stuff. I'm really fascinated with, kind of what led you to get into this field. I know you grew up in Connecticut, but if you could maybe just kind of take the listeners through a little bit of where this genesis came from.
Yeah, absolutely. I did not set out to do what I do from the get-go. I was just sort of kind of minding my P's and Q's. I was a project manager in the .com industry and then rose up the ranks, so to speak, and ran the project management office. And in that role, kept finding myself drawn to just the people. What is it that you need to be successful? How can I help support you? From there, I went on to run an entire law firm. And even in that role, kind of always found myself in that from a professional capacity. How can I help you? What is it that you need to grow and evolve? What is it that you want? Definitely built rapport with people. So it wasn't just professional. It was also personal. What do you want out of life? How can I help support those things? So that was professionally. On a personal level, I mommed of 5 and I was going through the teenage years with my kids were probably before I started my practice, they were, 2 years old up through maybe preteens. And I started to see them, especially my middle daughter, show up with a lot of people pleasing tendencies, anxiety, trying to, worried about perfectionism. And in those moments, and I am not shy to say that my children are my greatest teachers. I was being taught that they were reflecting back to me how I was showing up. And so it pushed me to do some self-reflection and some recognition of how have I been showing up in my world, and recognizing that I needed to do this self-work and really self-awareness. So I went through a huge self-growth journey, personal development journey.
Right.
And in that process, learned a lot about myself, learned a lot about where some of my perfectionism, my people-pleasing tendencies were coming from, recognizing that it wasn't with judgment on how I was brought up, but recognizing that my younger self dealt with certain things in a certain way, which then led to certain behaviors. And so for a long time, I was behind the scenes and wasn't really doing the thing that my 7-year-old self actually wanted to do. So that 7-year-old Kamini actually had this dream of just talking to people. She didn't know what that meant, but she wanted to talk to people one-on-one and just help them. And really, that's what my self journey allowed me to do, was recognize that I was going through these experiences, 1, to learn about myself, 2, to show up differently for my children, to change their trajectory, should they choose to change it. And also now I can take this experience and pay it forward. So then I recognized from a professional standpoint, I kept always going back to the people. And that was where I realized that these two things were meant to be synergized, be brought together, and to create this practice that I've now been running for about almost 7 years, where I'm working one-on-one with people.
So do you find that, I think it's so interesting to hear from a project management and running the law firm, there's this almost servant leadership there of helping, but then did you feel like you were trying to be a perfectionist? Like, because those seem like two completely opposite sides of the spectrum, right?
So yeah. And so only in hindsight could I see that when I was in the role doing the thing that lit me up was the servant leadership. The perfectionism actually kind of wasn't really there. It was when I stepped out of what I was being called to do, where that would pop up more, where it was, I needed to not fail. Right. So even like starting my own business, it's new, it's outside of my comfort zone. So maybe a little perfectionism there, because it was a fear of failure, fear of messing up. But as soon as I would tap back into the value, the why, all of that would it's there, but I learned to just let it kind of sit on the sideline, and I didn't have to pay as much attention to it.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it was fascinating for me to see you make that connection even years later, that, because of kind of entering into a new culture and being the only, you growing up as Indian from that culture into this kind of small town white community, that you were like, I felt like I was just always trying to seek acknowledgement, like people, because I think that a lot of people can resonate with this. And it's funny, I was thinking, because Brandon and I talk a lot of times about social media and what an impact that has had on the youth today. Can you imagine what you would have been going through had social media?
I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful that we did not have social media. We even had the regular old landline phones. It was nice to not have to necessarily constantly attach to my phone.
Yeah. It's so true. It is. But I mean, and I think it's one of those things, Kamini, that, we talk a lot about, I think right now, when in this quest for wellness and this quest that everybody has around mental health, and it's becoming more and more talked about, which is good, because for such a long time there was this stigma attached to all of it. But I think it's really important to understand the history of where people are coming from, because and that's what I think fascinates me about, what we get an opportunity to talk about on this podcast is, without fail, there's usually some underlying tone there. There's something that has kind of set this in motion, right? And so you being able to recognize that, and then more importantly, still seeing that kind of come through your children as well, and being able to recognize that, hey, I could go ahead and give them the systems and strategies now, because as a life coach and some of the things you've been able to do, how to do it, but that's not going to help necessarily until they get kind of to that root and understand maybe why they're doing it, right?
Absolutely. And to that point, I think one thing to just mention is many people think that we had to experience maybe what was people will refer to as a big T trauma. And that's why I'm very careful to say, I don't look back on anything with judgment or blame, but it's to recognize that my younger self assimilated certain experiences in a certain way and made them mean something. And there were little T traumas along the way, right? There were the ways that I was experiencing, having my name mispronounced in class and having everybody laugh. That's not a big trauma, but for a 5-year-old, that was a traumatic experience, right? And so it's to not discount and to compare people's experiences, because that's happened to me before, where I've been told, well, that's not a big deal. Why are you making such a big deal about it? It's just to recognize that we all have our own experiences. We're all going to make meaning of it in our own way. And that's where the work is to just get curious about, how did your younger self maybe assimilate certain experiences in order and made meaning of them. And that's what's playing in how you're showing up now. Or that could be the narrative that you're still operating from and when you don't have that awareness, you're operating kind of on autopilot. And to the point about the children, it is recognizing that if we don't do that self-work as parents, we are not showing up fully conscious and self-aware. And so we will perhaps start to project our own narratives or fears or stories onto our children. And so when we do that work and we become aware of those things, we can now show up in a different way for our children, so that maybe we don't repeat the same things over and over again. So for instance, I lovingly have called my mom out for it. Definitely people pleaser. She's always been the quote unquote peacemaker in her family. I absolutely learned a lot of that from her. And again, it doesn't come with judgment. It's to recognize, without that self-awareness for her, those were the things that I learned. I was starting to repeat those. And now I made an adjustment in how I'm showing up with my kids, so that they can see the difference between being empathetic versus over functioning for somebody.
Love that.
You just said something there with the empathy piece. I think as parents, sometimes we forget how to be empathetic at that level, because we think we've got a guide, and to say, well, that's not that big a deal, but to them, it's a huge deal, right? It's a massive deal. You said something also that you said one of my absolute favorite words, which is curious, right? John knows.
I knew Brandon was going to light up on that.
I love the idea of curiosity. And can you maybe talk about just how important that is to allow yourself to be both curious and also allow for you to be graceful as you look back on those times, to kind of really become self-reflective? I mean, it plays such a huge role, right?
Absolutely. My clients make fun of me because they'll start saying, I was curious, Kamini, because I say it all the time. And we just kind of laugh with one another, but it is true. I'll say compassionate curiosity or curiosity. I think that it's the antidote to judgment. It's the antidote to the constant self-criticism. So when we can lean into curiosity, when we can ask, ourselves, what's going on for me here? What part of me is showing up? That allows the room to lead into things like grace and self-compassion, because then we're actually learning more about what's coming up for ourselves instead of criticizing it and judging it. Because the moment we get into that criticism and judgment, we're kind of at a period. The sentence can't continue. If we get curious and we're learning things, we kind of add a comma and then we can continue the sentence. That's the best metaphor that I have for it.
Yeah, it's so good. I mean, there's so many things you've unpacked there. I feel like we could just dive into all of that, because one of the things you said, and I really want the listeners to hear this, and this is a little bit of off track of where we were headed with this, and we'll get to those topics here in a minute. But one of the things you said there, I want people to pay attention to, is the big T's and little T's, because as we are curious, it's also important that we maintain perspective and we understand that this is not like, and Brandon just touched on it. It's easy to say to somebody like, oh, that's not that big a deal or whatever, but to them, it's a big deal. I think about Brandon, Nina Sossaman Pogue, when she was on the show, and Nina wrote this, a book about this, and some thises are bigger than others, like this will pass, but you've got that. But then she also said something in Kamini in that interview where she talked about, if you look at your life, it's helpful to break things down in percentages, is to say, keeping in mind, like, as we get older, and now I'm 50 some years old, well, those experiences I had in grade school with maybe some of the people who were saying things that made me feel a certain way, that's only like 5% of my life. It's the 4%, 3%, whatever the case would be. And that's helpful as an adult to look at that. But when I'm that younger child going through that, this is 30% or 40% or that's a big, huge piece of my life. So that's also, I think, as parents, and it's important to be able to, you want to give that perspective, but also understand it yourself. Like, hey, it's easy to say like, hey, understand and be curious about this, but also understand this is a big deal to them.
Big deal. It's a big deal. Yeah. I mean, that used to come up a lot in the law firm, when clients would really freak out about their case. And the one thing that I would always remind people of is, this is their only case. We are managing the hundreds behind the scenes, but to them, this is their world.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with our kids, is the thing that they're experiencing is big for them. And having that respect as well as the empathy for that allows more room for us to ask those curious questions. Tell me more about what's happening for you here. Give me more. Let me hear more about that. I mean, I just had to do this yesterday with my 10-year-old. She was totally flipping out about her novel study. And I could have easily just been like, it's really not a big deal. Just, read. And instead it was, wow, this is really big. I want to hear more about what's really coming up for you.
I love it. Yeah, because you also give them, as you start to get curious and they're unpacking it, and you are in that, mode of tell me more, and continuing to say that to them, to let them really unpack everything. I find that oftentimes they, by doing that, start to kind of put things in perspective as well, or start to understand, like, okay, now that I'm saying this out loud, maybe it wasn't quite as big of a deal or whatever. But you almost have to give them permission, I think, at that age to continue to open up. But the more you do that, the healthier the relationship becomes, and the more I think they're willing to do that, instead of like just being able to jump right in and solve it. So, look, that's really, really good stuff. And it's, it kind of leads me into one of the things we wanted to talk to you about today, because you have a great, and, a lot of the guests that we have on our show coming from either some of that sports psychology piece, coming from mental performance standpoint, performance coaching, executive coaching, all that stuff. And that's why we were so excited to get you on the show, because not only do you come from some of that life coach experience, but you also are somebody who has children of your own, that you're navigating all of these things, which is always helpful. And Brandon and I talk a lot about this, but it's also, you have two that I'm thinking of specifically, high performing, children who are, one's a professional ballerina, the other one plays Division I lacrosse. And so we wanted to kind of get your perspective on some of the challenges, both from a parent standpoint and a coach standpoint, of what it's been like what have you learned as you've kind of watched them navigate their own journeys, about, some of the challenges that you've seen in high performing kids, and who, obviously are putting great pressure on themselves.
Yeah. And that's such a great question. And it's so important, I think, for us to talk about, because I think that achievement pressure it's huge. They're putting the pressure on themselves, but then there's also the external pressures too, because as you start to excel and you're getting stronger and better at a sport or at an art, there are external pressures. People expect you to do that and expect you to do more. I remember my son kind of having one of those identity crises of like, what if I don't make it to this level? Then I'm going to let people down. And we really unpack that together, because that shot all these all these red flags to me. Is like, what's happening here? What do you mean you're going to let people down? What people? Let's talk about this. But from a coach standpoint, as well as from a parent standpoint, for me, it always came back to helping them understand that their worth is not attached to the achievement, but it already exists in and of itself. That has been the thing that we continue to hone in on and we continue to talk about, because when you're in that realm, whether it be in the Division I sports, Division III sports, Division II sports, professional world as a ballerina, you are up against that day in and day out. And so that work doesn't stop. You consistently have to have those conversations with yourself, because it is so easy to get pulled right back into that rip current of, we're only going to look at the achievements. And let's talk about sports for a minute. We know for a fact that the coaches are looking at wins and losses. They're looking at stats. And so there are moments where you could be working really, really hard, but you're continuing to get overlooked. And in those moments, all that self-doubt will creep in. And it's like, well, clearly I'm not doing enough, or I'm not good enough. And that's where that inner work is so important, to recognize where do you measure up in terms of where have you been, like from last week to this week, and the most important part is, how have I shown up? Who have I been? Because that's where you're going to get that connection with self-worth as your own being, rather than only from achieving.
Yeah, and it's so key, and really for us to slow down on this one, because that gets into those controllables. It gets into, these are the things I can control in this process. I can't control what people are thinking about me. I can't control these other external things. I think about Damon West, who was on our show, who's great author of The Change Agent and Coffee Bean. And Damon said, never tie your identity to something that can be taken away. And it's true. It's like, so often I think we do this as young people, not just athletes, but just, could be students, could be whatever walk of life they're in. But to your point about that external thing, all of these things, whether I say I'm a baseball player, I'm a lacrosse player, whatever, that can all be taken away through injuries, through whatever the case would be. So if that's my identity, then when that's gone, so is the identity. And so that's where I start to feel like what's going on there.
Yeah. And to that point, I think that's why we deal with a lot of collegiate athletes who, at the end of their college years, whatever sport is done. And there's a lot of work, that mental health work and emotional health work, that needs to be done, because they were only identifying with that sport. And I'm that type of player. That's who I am. And they've lost track of who they are from a values-based perspective.
Yeah. And you also made me think about potential in that word, because when you start thinking about like the worth being attached to the achievement, one of the things that Brett McCabe, who I feel like today has just been like a, reflection day.
I mean, my goodness, just name drop Magoo today. Just, hey, let me tell you something. I ran into Brad Pitt the other day, but disclaimer,
like
I did it.
Show.
But, yeah.
People are like, I thought we already heard that one. No, but it's true. I mean, we'll be doing that with you, Kamini, here moving forward in future episodes. But it's one of those things that he wrote a book, Break Free from Suckville, which is a great book. And I would highly encourage you to read this book. You'd love it. But he talks about, potential. And what happens is people get into this mode of thinking they're not achieving their potential, or they're not living up to this. And most of the time it's external, to your point. But the other thing about potential, he says, is it's a moving target, because as you get better and you get better as a player, you get better as a performer or ballerina, dance, whatever the case would be, your potential is always moving up, because now you've elevated your skill set. So if you're chasing potential all the time as an athlete or whoever, it's going to be a long journey for you, because you're going to very rarely ever get to that point where you've quote unquote hit your potential.
Yeah. And I think it invites a new relationship with the concept of potential, where it's actually acknowledgement and acceptance that my potential will continue to grow. It'll continue to grow as I grow and evolve, rather than trying to get to the place. Instead of it being a destination or an outcome, it becomes part of the process and the evolution of you as an individual.
Yeah.
So along those same lines, I mean, I know one of the things that I talk to my son about a lot, because he's 16 and he has aspirations and all that. And we talk about progress over perfection constantly. Like, hey, but we're a little bit better today. Like, all that. One of the other things that I'm really curious to kind of get your ideas around is, there's no escaping if that is the path that you want to take. There's no escaping that whole potential thing, right? And so I try to shape it as, potential is a privilege, right? It's if you didn't have this and if you weren't on the right path, no one would be looking at you as though you had this potential. So you can allow them to do that, but you, as you try to digest it and internalize it, need to look at it more of a privilege. It's kind of like, gosh, who was it, John? Was it Reggie Jackson? The story I remember hearing is, Reggie Jackson or somebody was getting booed at a baseball game. And maybe it was Reggie saying it to Barry Bonds or something, but he basically said, "Hey, they don't boo nobody's kid." Like,
yeah,
kind of, it may be difficult at the time to kind of swallow, but understand the only reason they're even booing you is because you mean something and you've achieved something. So I guess my question is, do you subscribe to the potential is privilege and pressure is privilege, or is that really not the way to properly shape that?
I don't know if there's a right way or a wrong way. I think does that way work, especially in context of your son too. Does it work for him?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really the key, is that we just need to find a way to shape things where it actually serves us versus doesn't. I've actually never heard it that way. And I think that that's actually a very interesting way to shape it, is that this is a privilege. And it sort of it resonates with me because I tend to look at things instead of as good or bad or negative or positive. It's what information is it giving me, or what value is it potentially pointing out to me, right? So if we look at potential as a privilege, it's like, oh wow, this is showing me the value I have in certain things, or the value I have in my growth, or the value I have in continuing to take myself to the next level. Instead of it being an achievement pressure where it's, I'm not good enough unless I reach this achievement, it becomes, I'm continuing to live into this potential. And as that maybe grows and evolves, I have the privilege to continue to allow myself to grow into the next level that I have. None of that is tied to worthiness though, right? I think with the achievement pressure, that's when we get stuck in that rabbit hole of that's where worthiness exists versus worthiness is already there. And so I do think that being able to look at it as a privilege allows more room to see it as, I'm just continuing the next evolution of myself.
Yeah. And I like that because the Stoics would tell you that these are all things that are just happening. We're the ones that put the label to it. We're the ones that, whether we say it's a privilege, whether we say it's an opportunity, and I like the way you just framed that as like, what information do you have? Because from that, I can do whatever I want with it. That's the beauty of all of it. So, one of the things I've been noticing on your social media and in your website that you've talked a lot about, is self-leadership, in this idea of like, talk to us a little bit about this, because this is interesting to me, and I know will be interesting to the listeners, of just kind of what that whole internal leadership is all about.
Yeah. When I refer to self-leadership, it's really with there's so much talk around building our self-esteem and our self-confidence. And the part that isn't as talked about is self-acceptance. And self-acceptance says, I love all parts of myself. So when we're thinking about self-leadership, it's coming from a place of true self-acceptance, that I can recognize that I have certain parts that show up. Like for me, for instance, I know that I have an anxious part that still shows up. When she shows up, I kind of get curious with her and what's the purpose? What's the intention here? That self-acceptance and coming to that place of, I can accept all these parts of myself, allow for that self-leadership to happen, where now I'm not just only showing up with like one area of me, like, oh, my confident self has shown up today. No, it's all of me has shown up today. What does she need? What are her values? And what does she actually believe? What are those core beliefs about herself? Those three pillars will allow us to show up as our authentic self and become our own self-leader, because we're coming from a place of true alignment with self versus, masking, because really that's what happens when we only take certain parts of ourselves, we're masking other parts of ourselves. And self-leadership allows you to truly live into what it is that you believe in, what's meaningful to you, and what is it that you need, and communicating that to other people as well.
That's really cool, because I think, if I understand you correctly, that would be a good kind of defense mechanism against like imposter syndrome and stuff too, because the more I mask some of these other things, that's the more those thoughts would creep into my head. Like, I'm not worthy. I'm not, because now all of a sudden I'm starting to mask some of those things. You also made me think of, I read somewhere, somebody did a blog or an article about the importance of cleaning up. We talk all the time about the external environment, the out there, as far as like just, environmentally being more green, all that other stuff or whatever. But they talked about the importance of doing that internally, working on your internal environment, and the same thing, eradicating those things that might be causing problems. And you had a great analogy on your website about the swim like a duck. I thought was really cool. And for Brandon and the listeners, it was this idea that, self-care in such a way that the stressors roll off of you. So the more you're doing this kind of internal leadership, self-leadership, the better you're going to get naturally as it relates to. Can you just maybe share a little bit on that, the duck analogy? I thought was so great.
Yeah. So ducks have this oil, can we call it an oil? I'm not really sure, but they have whatever on their feathers that really, whenever they get wet, it literally, if you watch it, the water will beat up and just roll right off. And really what I'm working towards with my clients is that self-acceptance and that true recognition of all parts of yourself are welcome, and they all have an intention. Why? Because that's almost like the equivalent of the oil, right? So that when things happen and things are said to you, we can't control that. Those are all outside of our control, but it'll be like the water. It'll just roll off. We're not going to internalize. We're not going to make it mean something, because we've done all this work on the inside. I actually was talking to a client this morning, and she gave me another analogy. She's actually recovering from a knee surgery. And she said to me, Kamini, I realized that I was getting really frustrated because I couldn't bend my knee. And I'm realizing that really the stuff on the inside needs to be taken care of first and heal first, and then the outside will come. And I thought, that's a beautiful analogy as well, right? Even our own bodies do that when we're healing from like a surgery. We need the insides to heal first, and then the external, like being able to bend your knee or being able to walk again, right? It's the same concept. We just have to give ourselves the ability to heal, to build up that from the inside out. And we go so much further when we try to do everything on the external. A lot of people will say, well, I just need to change this habit. I love it. Like, yes, we want to change habits, but how long is that habit going to last? The new habit going to last if we don't go from the inside out and we only go from the outside in? We've got to change what's happening on that internal dialogue, or where we are inside. Otherwise, it might last for a week. It might last for a couple months, maybe a couple years, but what's the longevity of it?
Well, and I want to continue down this road, because I think this leads nicely into where we were taking the conversation as it relates to that athlete high performer piece of it, because I think that this also, whether that's the healing begins on the outside, it also, we see all the time, the better somebody is internally, the more relaxed and athletic they can be when it comes to the performance piece of it. Like, because now I'm not bogged down with all of the self-doubt. I'm not bogged down with all of the internal pressures I'm putting on myself as a result of some of the external forces. Could you talk a little bit about just kind of like, as you, whether that's with your son and daughter, whether it's with some of the folks that you're working with, it could be in the business aspect or the sports aspect with these high achievers, of how you are working with them on overcoming stress, like overcoming anxiety, and just that feeling I think we all could experience, I guess, of like being overwhelmed, or what some might even call burned out, whatever the case may be.
Yeah. So I take a slightly different route than most people. Most people will say, I just need this anxiety to go away. I need it to stop so that I can perform. And what I work with my clients on is shifting from making the anxiety stop and actually building a different relationship with it. Because the truth is, if you were able to get the anxiety to stop, you would have done it already, right? It's like saying, I need to stop. Like, again, I've said I'm an anxious person. those anxious parts of me will pop up every now and again, but I've changed the relationship with anxiety. And that's what I really work on with my high performers. And I've even worked on it with my own kids, where it's name and notice, or notice and name that the anxiety or the anxious thoughts have come up. And as you're naming and noticing them, come back to the present moment. We work on a lot of mindfulness, reground in the present moment, remind ourselves that we're actually safe. Everything is fine. Because anxiety, a lot of it is driven by either I'm unsure that I'm going to be okay, right? So it's a fear of I'm not going to be okay, or it's a lack of control. Generally speaking, it's one of those two things, or a version of that. So if we can name, okay, I'm having these thoughts, come back to the present moment, connect with self, remind yourself that you are safe, everything is fine. And then you anchor back into a values-based action, or where it is like, what's my intention in the next 5 minutes even? It's a way to kind of come back, especially as an athlete. I mean, if you're anxious and you're stuck in the chatter that's going on about, I need to make the next goal and, blah, 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 blah. I mean, I know I've talked to my son about this. You'll overshoot the goal every single time. If you notice and name, there it is, I'm having the thoughts, you come back to present moment, breathing, whatever grounding mechanism, we go through a lot of different grounding tools. You come back to this moment right here and right now, committed based action. Also, part of it is remembering, I know how to do this. I've done this before. I can trust myself. So you come up with your own mantras to bring you back into a single thought or one next action that you're going to take. And that's all you focus on. So for him, he plays, attacker midfield. For him, it's a lot of refocusing back into, I just got to get on the field. And my next step is get the ball, right?
Yeah.
So that's all he focuses on. It's not about taking the shot and making the goal.
Yeah. It's so funny because Brandon and I talk all the time. What's his episode? I don't know, 120 or something, like getting up there. And there's these threads that kind of go throughout all of the episodes, whether we're talking to individuals like yourself, or they're talking to sports psychologists, whether they're talking to executive coaches, whatever the case would be, is that idea of recognize, release, and refocus. It's like, okay, this is acknowledging that this is happening, because to your point, and I used to say as a mental performance coach, my goal is not to get people to think more positively. It's to get them to think less negatively. It is the, or at least be able to, if I hear you correctly, understand that you're going to, like this idea of turning our mind off. I always say you can't do that. There is no like faucet, that you can be like, oh, okay, I'm going to turn my mind off. It's either looking forward or looking back, but it's how we can get that into that neutral thought to where it's just, okay, but we have to, and I love what you're saying there is like, be in a relationship with that. And then I wrote down committed based action. I love that, because it's like, you got to, once we've done all of that, recognize, release and refocus, you now have to do something. You've got to take action.
Take action. And if you do a committed based action and it's values based, it's going to be meaningful to you. So there's going to be the intrinsic motivation to do it. And I always say it doesn't have to be huge. It can be the smallest thing, but just commit to that one meaningful action, and it continues to move you forward.
So good.
It's interesting too, John, because we have heard from people about where commitment can always outweigh. I'm thinking of the
confidence.
Exactly. Commitment over confidence every time.
Yep.
And I think that is definitely again, from a growth mindset perspective, I think high achievers are okay with making mistakes and failing on the commitment if they're committed, because it then goes back to what you were saying, but what did I learn from it? And so from that, and it all ties into the curiosity piece for me, right? Is okay. So what? I stubbed my toe. Okay. It was a setback, but what can I learn from it? One, let's let's turn a light on in the middle of the night, right? Like whatever it is that you can pull from it. And it does seem to be one of those things that those people that achieve it's to me, it's a little bit of a dichotomy. They are not scared to fail because they know that they can learn from it. But by the same token, they are so driven to not succeeding is not an option. right? And so they never look at one of those setbacks, to your point, as either a big T. It's not even a little T. It's just, hey, it's a learning opportunity, and we go that route. But I think everybody still has that anxiety, and it's probably more present because those high achievers think they can control their environments a lot more too, right? So, I mean, how do you express to somebody that, hey, you don't have control here? Like, do you find that that's something that you like? I went to therapy and have been in therapy for a long time. And the thing that I always took from it was not my circus, not my monkeys. Right.
Yes.
I mean, that was just a huge thing. And my kids hear me say it all the time. Like they'll do something or they'll ask me about something. I'm like, hey man, not your circus, not your monkeys. Like you don't have to worry about that. Is that something that you work a lot with? Is the control aspect?
Yeah. And it sounds so rudimentary, but sometimes it's as simple as saying to the person in front of me, what if this is in your control? Right. Just having them take a step back to be like, oh, you're right. None of that, how that person shows up or what they say or how they respond to me. I control none of that. All that's within my control is how I choose to either respond to a situation or how I choose to show up. And the choices in terms of, what I believe and what actions I take, that's all within my control. But a lot of times there is that recentering of just simply asking, is like, out of any of this that I'm going through, what is in my control here? Because most often we are struggling with all the things outside of our control. That's what's causing the anxiety, or that's what's causing the stress and the overwhelm or the frustration. And when we can just name it, and it's like, oh yeah, I have no control over that. Now we're inviting radical acceptance, where it is, where we say, that is what it is. I don't have to be okay with it. I don't have to love it. I don't have to condone it, but I'm just going to let it be. And I'm going to now figure out how I want to move forward.
I saw a reel on Instagram, and I would love to give credit to where it's due, but I can't for the life of me remember, but it was actually brilliant. And it was a guy that was speaking to a clinician, and he said, how do you treat anxiety or situational anxiety? And he said, I tell clients I want you to write down on a piece of paper this issue, like you're saying, name it. Okay. Now, with all this stuff going on, what can you control out of it? Okay. And he said, usually there's 100 things going on, but there's one or two things that they can actually control. And then he said, so do something about that. Like, here it is. You've named it, to your point.
Yeah.
Now do something about that. And that's all you can do. And I know that sounds very simple, but it is, it's interesting to me how, if we can just take steps back every once in a while and truly pull away and look at the situation, you can realize pretty quickly it's nowhere near what we've built it up to be
in our head. And and I do something very similar, where I really do ask them to write it out on a piece of paper for two reasons. One, the brain needs an output channel, but also it allows that, it's ridiculous to say this, but it allows physical space for you to actually step into observer, because now you're seeing it in front of you.
Right.
And so you're able to actually see from like almost like a pictorial version of it, of like, okay, this is the anxiety in front of me. Right. And these are the one or two things that I can control. These are all of the things that I'm worried about. These are the one or two things. So it's such a great way. And a lot of people kind of will laugh when I say that, but we sometimes have to see it. And if we're only thinking about it, we are stuck in our own thoughts. That's why they say journaling helps, and brain dumping on a piece of paper helps. People kind of, laugh and be like, oh, I don't have time for that. Well, really, if you can make the time, even if it's like 2 to 3 minutes, getting it out of here onto paper, giving your brain an output channel, it's one, being witnessed. And most of what we need in life is to be witnessed as humans. We need to be witnessed. And also it allows it to go somewhere, and you don't have to carry it with you anymore.
Yeah. When I'm working with teams, I will also do that. Like on a flip chart, I'll just ask them to, like, when you think about the course of a baseball game, something like that, what are the things you can control, what you can't control? The other thing, and for the listeners, because I know we have a lot of like managers and leaders of teams and stuff, is if you aren't at the point you're just having a conversation, one of the things I like to do to reframe people is just to say, as they get done telling me the story, is, oh, well, what role do you play in that? Like, what's your role in all of that? And it just gets them to understand, like, because they have to now think, like, what is my role in all of this? And most of the time it's like, I don't really have a role in it, but they just identified a problem, or they just wanted to talk about, it's like,
the other thing that question, I think, invites, and maybe I'm totally off base, but I think it invites a little more empathy into the conversation too, right? Yeah. Where you can recognize, like, if they do name a role that they have, it's like, maybe ask that question of, how am I showing up with empathy in this at all? Because maybe if I lean into empathy in this situation, I can have a different dialogue with the people on my team. I mean, I talk about a lot, like, for business leaders, that's what we talk a lot about is, can we build this muscle of empathetic leadership?
No
Why?
question.
Because when you're able to bring that into the fold and you recognize that this is a human being in front of you, they're not just here to achieve or just to do, that allows that room to have different conversations.
Yeah. I think all of that together, because asking that specific question, because then to your point about the empathy, is now it at least allows them to narrow the focus onto something specific, because I can help if we're just going to be spitballing solutions and a bunch of things, since you just brought me a random problem, but let's at least start to focus in on something that we can talk about and maybe explore a little bit further. So, what are, just in the last bit of time we have with you here, I did want to make sure, because you teach a lot and coach a lot on this idea of like self-sabotage and self-doubt, like, and I think it's something that everybody, I mean, just saying those words, I imagine some of the listeners being like, oh, okay, like perking up, like, here we go. What are some other ways we're doing that? I mean, in some of the clients you're working with, some of the people, like, how are we continuing to self-sabotage out there?
Well, I think that first of all, let me just speak on self-sabotage for just a quick second. I believe that it's the part of us it's a protective part. It's trying to keep us from maybe potentially experiencing hurt or sadness with some experience that we're about to have, right? So when we're talking about athletes, it could be self-sabotaging in the sense of, I don't want to face the hurt I'll feel if I don't make XYZ team or I don't reach the Division I level. For my ballerina, it was a lot of ballerinas will self-sabotage around just the fear, again, of not getting the contract that they want. And so they themselves allow that to take over. It's almost like it's a sense of control. If I kind of make this end now, I'm controlling the fallout. I know it's coming. I know the disappointment's here. So it's a way to still have control over the situation. When we're talking about self-sabotage, it is important to recognize that and to also name and call out that self-doubt part of ourselves, where it's like, oh, this is the part of me that is afraid of failing, or this is the part of me that is has a fear around people not accepting you, whatever the thing may be.
Right.
And recognize that it has an intention to keep you safe, but then also recognize that if we allow that part to run the show, we're not even going to give ourselves the chance or the opportunity to potentially maybe be quote unquote successful, or at least grow and continue to evolve to the next level. So it goes back to that whole concept of self-acceptance and the parts work that I do with my clients, which is get familiar with that part, understand that part has an intention. And instead of saying, make it go away, recognize that self-sabotage part is a protective part. It's coming up to keep you from failing. But every time that we allow that part to run the show, we're already sort of saying, I can't achieve the thing that I'm setting out to do. So what would we want to do instead? What other parts of ourselves can we bring into the conversation or to bring up and allow to also have a voice here? And that's when you start leaning into, well, there's a part of me that knows I have a strength in this. There's a part of me that knows that I have a look for my daughter, love of dancing. There's a part of me that knows that I've been studying this since the age of 2. Now we're allowing more parts in, and it's not just the self-sabotage, fear-based part to run the show. And that, I mean, this is true story. I mean, she's all of 5 feet, and, some ballet companies want their women to be at least 5'2". You're not going to change your height. She could have easily gone into self-sabotage and just not even tried because of it's, I don't want to keep getting rejected because that feels gross. So I'm going to maybe only apply to schools or companies that want women over 5'2", because that would be a self-sabotaging behavior. Instead, it was, okay, there's a part of me that's I'm afraid of this. And also I'm going to lean into the fact that I have been training since I was 2. I know that I've been perfecting and working towards crafting my steps and whatnot, and lean into that in order to continue moving forward. Because if we let the self-sabotage run, or that fear of failure run the show, we're already, there's no possibility to move forward.
So in that instance, are we saying that we are okay failing, or we'll lessen that blow? It'll be a glancing blow, right? If I'm in control versus that knockout punch. Is that?
That's the lie that we tell ourselves, right?
Okay.
Like, oh, this is not going to hurt as much because
Right.
it's just I know it's coming. Right. It's the best example I can give is like with relationships. A lot of people will be like in this relationship and everything's going well, and then they sabotage it. They go and whatever, infidelity,
Sure.
whatever. Why? Subconsciously, they're afraid of it not it falling apart and not seeing it. And so they're like, you know what? Again, this is all on the subconscious level.
Sure.
They go and do something to end the relationship because then they kind of have control over it. It still hurts. Like,
Sure.
It's a lie we tell ourselves. If I self-sabotage, I've got control over this. Again, outside of our control. We know it's coming, but it's still going to hurt. I mean, it's, you know it, you're about to get run over. Like, it's still going to hurt.
Right. Yeah. Right. The train's coming. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's going to hurt either way.
Yeah.
Whether I knew it was coming or not, it's going to hurt.
Right.
We lie to ourselves and say, if I know it's coming, it's still going to hurt.
Yeah.
That's the thing too. Sorry. One more thought.
Sure.
And I don't mean to talk over you. Part of it is this idea that pain is part of the human experience, right? And we spend so much time trying to avoid pain. Really what it comes down to is accepting pain as part of the human experience. Suffering is the choice, right?
Right.
So when we lean into that, the idea of what the self-sabotage does, right? This idea of I'm going to control the pain and the hurt. No, we're still going to have pain. There's still going to be pain. It's how do we respond to it? What do we choose to do after that?
But if you don't have the pain, then how do you experience if you don't
growth.
have the lows, how do you truly get the joys of the high?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I like the idea of getting very specific about, what's the fear and what are we trying to avoid? I had a business mentor a few years ago, and I was kind of debating whether or not I was going to pursue an opportunity with my company. And I remember saying, I'm not really sure if I'm going to pursue it. I don't know if I'm going to do that. And he asked me, he said, so what's your biggest fear of going for this job? And I said, well, not getting it, and he said, so your fear is really, you're afraid of staying right where you are. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay. So now it was like, now let's unpack that. Right. But it was like, and that's why I think it's so valuable to have coaches like yourself, life coaches, executive coaches. Like, I just am such a firm believer everybody needs a coach, and for a million reasons, but mainly to be somebody who's confident enough to sit on the outside and look in and ask some of the questions that maybe just give you another way of thinking about something, give you another way to look at it, because that moment really got to me as like my fear I was walking around with was staying static. And so once I recognized that, it gave me permission to be like, well, no, I'm pursuing some of these other opportunities, not for any other reason that I want to progress. I want to go beyond where I currently am or whatever, but it took somebody to ask that question of, so really you're afraid of just being where you are,
Yeah.
And it just kind of reframed that whole thinking.
Yeah. And I agree with you wholeheartedly, by the way, because even I think the best coaches have coaches. So I absolutely have one, because sometimes we're so close to the situation. We do need somebody else to bring in this other perspective or just another way of looking at it. Just maybe turn it 180 degrees. And suddenly we're like, oh yeah, because with that question or reframing it that way, really what he was able to do is point out that your value or what was meaningful for you was taking the next step. It was advancing, it was growth. And then when you look at it that way, it's, oh, wow. So my values-based action is to apply for this or to take that next step, right?
Yeah. No question about it. Well, look, I mean, KaminiWood.com, listeners, you need to go. And I'm telling you, we literally, when I say unpack the tip of the iceberg, I've got like a whole nother page of some questions that we were going to ask her. But it's because there's so much depth to what she's able to talk about. There's so much depth to the knowledge that she brings to the table. And real quickly, if you have a couple more minutes, I did want you to just talk. You're the creator of AuthenticMe. We talked about that in the introduction, and then CEO of Live Joy Your Way. Maybe just tell the listeners there about AuthenticMe.
Yeah. The AuthenticMe came out of my my desire for people to just give themselves permission to understand who they are and to unmask and allow themselves to just be their authentic self without constantly worrying about meeting someone else's expectations or looking for that external validation, but just be who they are and be okay with that, like truly okay with it. It's okay to unmask. And it came out of my own self-work. Comes out of raising my kids where I'm constantly telling them it's okay to be exactly who you are. It's a sort of like an homage, so to say, to like my 5-year-old self who went into school and thought that she had to do something different because here she was a little bit darker than the other kids with an odd name. No, all she had to do is just be herself. And that was really all that we all are meant to be, is just be ourselves. And if we can get to that place, and get to live the life that we really want.
Yeah, and you realize pretty quickly as you get older and you start talking to more and more people, they were all experiencing the same thoughts you were experiencing. The people you were trying to impress, the people you were trying to, mask things from, were doing the same thing back at you. It's just amazing. If we could all, I always say, if we could all just be our true authentic selves for one day and tell everybody exactly what we're, feeling and thinking, what a better place we'd be, because you'd recognize that everybody is dealing with the same stuff. So, well, guys, look, in Kamini, thank you so much. I mean, we're going to have to get you back on the show at some point because there is some other things I would like to unpack with you. But you've been so gracious with your time today. Again, KaminiWood.com. Where else can they find you on social media? Any other platforms? Instagram,
Facebook, Pinterest, all with the handle It's AuthenticMe.
It's AuthenticMe. Well, you were very authentic in all of your answers today, and we really appreciate your knowledge and your time you spent with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Want to provide feedback or stay up to date with the show? Visit our Instagram page at Mental Advantage Podcast, or you can send us an email at podcast@mentaladvantage.net. To have John Cullen work with you or your team, please write to him at john.cullen@mentaladvantage.net. Thanks for listening to today's episode.